Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for attending or tuning into our 44th episode of the Peaceable Kingdom Hour, which is titled Methodism. My name is Matthew A. King, and I am your host. This live stream is made possible in collaboration with allcreatures.org, leading the way in faith-based vegan animal rights since 1998, and with the Christian Animal Rights Association, a non-denominational Bible-based ministry. All opinions and teachings expressed in this series are the commentaries of me, Matthew A. King. So with the teaching agenda today, we're going to talk about first a disclaimer, then we're going to discuss the definition of Methodism, followed by Methodist history, beliefs, distinct practices, worship, and church structure. Then we're going to look at quotes from the founder of Methodism, John Wesley, regarding animals, as well as a focus on the vegetarianism of John Wesley. Then we're going to look at the quotes from a contemporary Methodist named David Clough. And then that'll close our program. But first, as always, the disclaimer, if anything you perceive as offensive or, you feel the need to step out, not listen to anything that's offensive, feel free to do so. It's not intended to be offensive. It's just discussing history and the nature of Methodism. But what is Methodism? So Methodism is an 18th century movement founded by John Wesley that sought to reform the Church of England from within. So Methodism is very closely associated with Anglicanism or Episcopalianism, which is what we talked about 2 weeks ago. But the movement, however, became separate from its parent body and developed into an autonomous church. And so Methodism split off from Episcopal churches or Anglican. The World Methodist Council, WMC, an association of churches in the Methodist tradition, comprises more than 40.5 million Methodists in 138 countries. So Methodism is a pretty big following, pretty big denomination. But the history of Methodism is inescapably linked with its founder, John Wesley. And that's something that I'm going to talk about throughout the teaching. You'll notice is that John Wesley's name will come up a lot. But its origins, John Wesley was born in 1703, educated in London and Oxford, and was ordained a deacon in the Church of England in 1725. In 1726, he was elected a fellow of Lincoln College at Oxford. And in the following year, he left Oxford temporarily to act as a curate to his father, the rector of Epworth. And a curate is basically a person that is a worker at a church, is what that means. So he worked at the church under his dad. But Wesley was ordained a priest in the Church of England in 1728 and returned to Oxford in 1729. And so he was very much involved with the Anglican Church because he was in England. Studied at Oxford as well. And back in Oxford, he joined his brother Charles and a group of earnest students who were dedicated to frequent attendance at Holy Communion, serious study of the Bible, and regular visitations to the filthy Oxford prisons. And so that's something that is very important to talk about with Methodism, is that John Wesley and his brother Charles very much affiliated with social justice. And that's something that you'll see permeating throughout Methodism. And they would often study the Bible. They would go and visit prisoners at the Oxford prisons. And then they also would be very serious about taking Holy Communion. And so the members of this group, which Wesley came to lead, were known as Methodists because of their methodical devotion and study. And so they had sort of a method to their madness, and that's why they were called Methodists, is because they would break down the Bible. They would have a method to the way that they practiced their Christianity. In 1735, at the invitation of the founder of the colony of Georgia, James Edward Oglethorpe, both John and Charles Wesley set out for the colony to be pastors to the colonists and missionaries. It was hoped to the Native Americans. And so Wesley did come over to the United States around the time of the French and Indian War, before the American Revolution. And a lot of it was dedicated to being a missionary to the Native Americans and also to the early colonists. But unsuccessful in their pastoral work and having done no missionary work, the brothers returned to England conscious of their lack of genuine Christian faith. They looked for help to Peter Bowler and other members of the Church of the Brethren who were staying in England before joining Moravian settlements in the American colonies. Excuse me. John Wesley noted in his journal that at a Moravian service on May 24, 1738, he felt his heart strongly warmed. He continued, "I felt I did trust in Christ alone for salvation, and an assurance was given me that he had taken away my sins, even mine, and saved me from the law of sin and death." And so Wesley became pretty serious about his faith around 1738. Charles Wesley, his brother, had reported a similar experience a few days previously. And some months later, George Whitefield, also an Anglican clergyman who had undergone a conversion experience, invited his friend John Wesley, to come to the city of Bristol to preach to the colliers of Kingswood Chase, who lived and worked in the most debased conditions. And colliers were coal miners. That's what that means. So they would go and preach to the coal miners in England, and that was during the Industrial Revolution. And so, they were in pretty horrid conditions. But Wesley accepted the invitation and found himself, much against his will, preaching in the open air. This enterprise was the beginning of the Methodist revival. And so Whitefield and Wesley at first worked together, but later separated over Whitefield's belief in double predestination, the belief that God had determined from eternity whom he would save and whom he will damn. Wesley regarded this an erroneous doctrine and insisted that the love of God was universal. And so that's something that you'll notice too within Methodism, is that they're very much Arminian, which is the belief that man has a say in whether he is saved or not. And so God doesn't basically predetermine, he leaves it up to man's choice to be saved or not. Whereas Calvinists, they believe in predestination, which is that God chooses who he will save and who he will damn to hell. Methodists are Arminian, and so they believe in the opposite of that. And that's something also that's very important to understand, very different from the Calvinist traditions, which are Presbyterian. Under the leadership of Whitefield and that of Wesley, the movement grew rapidly among those who felt neglected by the Church of England. And so, again, Methodism sort of picking up the stragglers of Anglicanism who felt that Anglicanism had failed them. But Wesley differed from contemporary Anglicans not in doctrine, but in emphasis. He claimed to have reinstated the biblical doctrines that human beings may be assured of their salvation, and that the power of the Holy Spirit enables them to attain perfect love for God and their fellows in this life. Wesley's helpers included only a few ordained clergymen and his brother Charles, who wrote more than 6,000 hymns to express the message of the revival. And that's something that's we'll get into in a bit, but Charles Wesley, John's brother, was very much a hymn writer, and his hymns are actually still used within the Methodist tradition. In spite of Wesley's wish that the Methodist Society would never leave the Church of England, relations with Anglicans were often strained. And so there again, Methodism had broken off from Anglicanism. In 1784, when there was a shortage of ordained ministers in America after the Revolution, the Bishop of London refused to ordain a Methodist for the United States. And so there's that straining again. Feeling himself forced to act and believing that biblical principles allowed a presbyter to ordain, Wesley ordained Thomas Coke as superintendent and 2 others as presbyters. In the same year, by a deed of declaration, he appointed a conference of 100 men to govern the Society of Methodists after his death. Wesley's ordination set an important precedent for the Methodist Church, but the definite break with the Church of England came in 1795, 4 years after his death. And so Wesley died in 1791, but they broke off from Anglicanism not long after Wesley's death. The Wesleyan Methodist Church grew rapidly, numbering 450,000 members by the end of the 19th century. And so, within 10 years, it had grown to already almost 500,000 members. Its growth was largest in the expanding industrial areas where the Methodist faith helped workers, both men and women, to endure economic hardship while they alleviated their poverty. And so Methodism was very successful preaching to the workers of the Industrial Revolution. Because their faith encouraged them to live simply, their economic status tended to rise. And so Wesleyan Methodism has always been about simple living as well. The Methodist Church has shared in the numerical decline that has plagued English churches since about 1910. And so England has experienced a large exodus from their Christianity. And a lot of that is probably because of Charles Darwin. Darwin came out with his On the Origin of the Species in the late 1800s. And then English churches had already started to see the decline around 1910. And so this decline, together with broader social and cultural changes, inspired a desire to express Wesley's original ideals in a contemporary form. And so the church planned new evangelical missions, developed the Kingswood School, which was Wesley's foundation, and other boarding schools, and trained Christian teachers at Westminster and Southland colleges, activities that continued throughout the rest of the 20th century. And so its strong interest in social issues has expanded to include a wide range of national and international problems, especially those connected with race, poverty, and peace. And that's something that I love about Methodists too, is that they have a large grappling with social justice issues. And that's something that I've found amongst a lot of Methodists. He's probably not watching right now, but my good friend Haven, he runs a fish welfare organization overseas, and he actually is a Methodist. His mom and dad were both Methodist preachers, and I met him at a conference in Washington, D.C. last year. but I could tell, very much a focus on social justice, and that's something that you'll find amongst a lot of Methodists. But the Methodist Church immediately became involved in an ecumenical movement and later was a founding member of the British Council of Churches in 1942 and the World Council of Churches in 1948. And throughout the 20th century, it participated in interdenominational dialogues and sought to create unions across denominational boundaries. And so Methodism has always been sort of trying to bridge the gap between denominations, very much intent on preserving Christianity as a whole, even though the denominational differences. The church also engaged in official discussion with Roman Catholics on national and world levels and found a surprising degree of agreement, while it promoted tolerance and understanding on previously contentious issues. And so always trying to make peace. And then in the United States, in America, Methodism was introduced into America by Irish immigrants who had been converted by John Wesley. And so these Irish immigrants directly knew John Wesley that had immigrated to the United States. Wesley also sent preachers, the most successful of whom was Francis Asbury, a blacksmith who arrived in 1771. He adapted Wesley's principles to the needs of the settled communities and at the frontier, but unlike Wesley, Asbury supported the American Revolution and the New Republic. And so Wesley did not agree with the American Revolution and the New Republic, which makes sense because he wanted the unity between the Anglican Church and the Methodist Church before it was founded. And so it would only make sense that he didn't want the United States to break off from England. Despite this difference, Wesley sent the presbyters he ordained along with Thomas Coke, that superintendent that he had spoke highly of as superintendent, to help Asbury in 1784. In the same year, the Methodist Episcopal Church was organized, and Asbury and Coke allowed themselves to be called bishops. And so there you can even see it's called the Methodist Episcopal Church, which means that it was connected to Anglicanism at one time and before it broke off. During the next 50 years, the church made remarkable advances led by the circuit riders who preached to the people on the frontier in simple terms. And so Methodism was very much a frontier religion. As the United States started to experience the movement west to settle the West and the frontier, Methodism followed that and sort of preached to the frontiersmen that were looking for gold and looking for opportunity in the western part of the United States after the American Revolution and the Louisiana Purchase. But at the same time, the church faced schism over issues of race and slavery. And so now, as we're heading towards the late 1700s, we're getting into the early 1800s. And that's where talk of abolition of slavery started. And as you probably already know, slavery was abolished in the United States in 1865 after the Civil War. And so that time between the American Revolution and 1865 involving slavery was a hot button contentious issue. And the churches were affected by that. And so the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, which was founded in 1821, and the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which was founded in 1816, were formed because of the racial prejudice experienced by African Americans in the Methodist Episcopal Church. The slavery issue split the Methodist Church into two bodies, the Methodist Episcopal Church and the Methodist Episcopal Church South, which was organized in 1845, about 20 years before the abolition of slavery. After the Civil War, the two main churches grew rapidly and gradually became assimilated to the general pattern of American Protestantism. And so after the issue of slavery was resolved, they again assimilated into each other again. But when it was clear that the old issues no longer divided them, they began to move together. But it was not until 1939 that they formed the Methodist Church, which the smaller Methodist Protestant Church, which was established in 1830, also joined. Women were given limited clergy rights in 1924 and were accepted for full ordination in 1956. So again, that social justice issue. Methodists were giving limited clergy rights to women in 1924, and then they accepted women were fully ordained in 1956, which is still an issue that churches are divided over to this day. But the Methodists have sort of always been ahead of the game. In 1980, the United Methodist Church elected its first woman bishop, and it had elected more since. And then in Canada, Methodism was introduced into Canada by preachers from the United States and later reinforced by British Methodists. In 1874, the Methodist Church of Canada became autonomous, and it went on to negotiate a union with other Canadian non-Episcopal churches to form the United Church of Canada in 1925. An independent Methodist presence in Canada essentially ended with ratification of the union. And so the United Church of Canada sort of absorbed all of these different denominations. And so Methodism basically sort of ended on its own in Canada. But Canadian Methodists joined the new church, which drew from the traditions of its constituent members to establish the basic beliefs and practices of the new church. And so, not a big presence of Methodism in Canada, yet very much influence in Canada. And then teachings, Methodism is marked by an acceptance of the doctrines of historical Christianity, by an emphasis on doctrines that indicate the power of the Holy Spirit to confirm the faith of believers and to transform their personal lives, by an insistence that the heart of religion lies in a personal relationship with God, and by simplicity of worship, by the partnership of ordained ministers and laity in the worship and administration of the church, and a concern for the underprivileged and the improvement of social conditions. So again, there's very much a big part of the Methodist tradition is that concern for the underprivileged and the improvement of social conditions. And you see that within a lot of Methodists. And at least in its British form, by the formation of small groups for mutual encouragement and edification. And that's something that a lot of churches do to this day too, is small groups. They'll meet during the week and sort of discuss the sermon from Sunday. But all Methodist churches accept the scriptures as a supreme guide to faith and practice. Most welcome the findings of modern biblical scholarship, that the fundamentalist groups among them do not. And so some of the more fundamentalists reject the idea that, the Bible might have passages in it that aren't supposed to be there, or things like that. The churches follow the historical creeds and believe that they are part of the tradition of the Protestant Reformation. They emphasize the teaching of Christian perfection, interpreted as perfect love, which is associated with John Wesley, who held that every Christian should aspire to such perfection with the help of the Holy Spirit. That's a big part of what they preach. And then I had a comment come through, actually. It says, Luke Daniels, hi, Matthew, tuning in. Thanks so much, Luke. I appreciate it. Thank you very much. Methodist churches affirm infant baptism, so that's something that they do as well. We'll get into that next week about how Baptist churches do not do that. And that's a big area of contention. Methodists also regularly receive the sacrament of the Lord's Supper, in which they believe Christ to be truly present, though they have no precise definition of the manner of his presence. They believe that they are integral parts of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, and that their ministers are true ministers of word and sacrament in the Church of God. And then as far as worship and organization, the patterns of service. Methodist worship everywhere is partly liturgical and partly spontaneous. The general pattern was established by John Wesley, who regularly used the Anglican Book of Common Prayer, which he adopted for use in the United States, and conducted services that include extemporaneous prayer. And so this tradition continued in British Methodism into the 20th century, when it underwent change. And so the practice of Anglican morning prayer was eliminated first, and during the liturgical movement, when Roman Catholic and Protestant churches revised their liturgies, Anglican Holy Communion was dropped. And so the liturgical movement also influenced the Methodist Service Book in 1975, the Methodist Worship Book in 1999 in Britain, and in the United States, the Book of Worship, which was published in 1965, the Ordinal in 1980, and the United Methodist Hymnal, subtitled the Book of United Methodist Worship from 1988. And so the reforms provided new opportunity for congregational participation. The Sunday service for Holy Communion restores the traditional fourfold pattern, which was the offering of bread and wine, the thanksgiving, the breaking of bread, and the sharing of the elements. And that's something that you'll see within Methodist churches. Non-liturgical services, which constitute the majority, claim to be spontaneous, but are not. In British, but not in American Methodism, many services are conducted by lay preachers. So Britain has many services that have just lay preachers. None of them are even, a lot of them are not even ordained, which is not a problem. Hymns are important in all branches of Methodism. The most important hymns of British Methodism are those of Charles Wesley. We talked about that before, how Charles Wesley is John Wesley's brother, and he was very much a hymn writer. So they used a lot of his hymns. They are mingled with many contemporary hymns as well as those from other traditions. American books contain fewer hymns by Wesley. And then as far as the polity in the churches of the British tradition, the annual conference is the supreme authority for doctrine, order, and practice. And so they're very, very different from the Congregationalists. Congregationalists basically decide the church has broad decision-making policies, whereas in Wesleyanism, the annual conference is basically the supreme authority for all churches. So there's a bigger body at stake. All ministers have equal status, but the president and secretary of the conference, the chairman of districts, the secretaries of divisions, and superintendents exercise special duties. District affairs are regulated by synods, circuits by circuit meetings, local societies by church councils. And then the American tradition is Episcopal, which means Anglican. The bishops are elected by the jurisdictional conferences, which, like the General Conference, meet every 4 years. So they meet every 4 years with that. And each Episcopal area has an annual conference and district conferences, each with its superintendent. Formerly, ministers were ordained first a deacon, then an elder. Since 1996, when the transitional diaconate was abolished, ministers have been ordained as either a deacon or an elder. So they can be either or. Both are permanent clergy orders that are distinct in character but equal in authority. And then there are Methodist churches in most European countries. Those in Italy and Portugal are of English origin. So the English settlers ended up in Italy and Portugal. And then they were missionaries in England and Portugal from England, Italy and Portugal. And then those in Germany were of mixed English and American origin. And so missionaries from England and the United States settled in Germany and then spread Methodism. The Methodist churches in the rest of Europe are derived from American Methodism, though they exhibit many similarities in spirituality to the English type. And so they sort of adopted a lot of English policies, even though the American Methodists were the ones that spread it into Europe, ironically. And so Methodism is sort of a Western religion. A lot of it went west, and then it kind of went back east. And then missions, there's the ceaseless travels of Thomas Coke, which is a common name within Methodism. They were the beginning of the British Methodist missionary tradition. The first area where missions took root was the West Indies, and then came Sierra Leone and Southern Africa. The Gold Coast, French West Africa, and Nigeria received missionaries not much later, though the climate in many parts of Africa took a toll on missionary lives. And so there was a lot of missionaries from Methodism within Africa, but then they didn't survive because of probably the heat, probably because of malaria, probably because of war, things like that were going on. In India, there were very few converts until about 1880, when many thousand low-caste Indians in the South joined the Methodist and other churches. And so it has a pretty big presence in India. In China, missionary work had a checkered career. Although there were mass movements there, the last missionary left China in 1949 when the communists came to power on the mainland. And so communists, they tend to view the state as the religion. And so naturally, religions got sort of pushed out of China, Methodism included. In Australia, the Methodist Church began in 1815, and like the Methodist Church in South Africa, became independent before the end of the 19th century. And then after World War II, the missionary churches became autonomous. Only a few small churches remain under the control of the overseas division of the British Church. And so a lot of these churches, because they came from England, probably viewed it as independence for their church as well as their country. Most of the autonomous churches combined with other churches in their countries. For example, the Church of South India, which has been in existence since 1947, includes Anglicans, Methodists, Congregationalists, and Presbyterians. And so there's been a lot of unity between denominations in a lot of areas, including India as well as Canada. American Methodists have been equally enthusiastic missionaries, and their greater resources have carried them over still larger areas of the globe. North India, Mexico, most of Latin America, Cuba, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and many parts of Africa possess Methodist churches of the American tradition. And so Methodism has grown worldwide, and we can see that very easily on the map. And then the next thing I want to talk about here before I take a breather, John Wesley, a friend to animals. And that's something that's a big part of this I wanted to discuss with all of you. John Wesley was one of the best advocates for animals that we ever had as far as Christianity. But John Wesley, he wrote on animal salvation, and you can see this in his writings actually. But John Wesley, he had a lifelong interest in animal life, and it is well known that he was an advocate for the protection of animals against abuse from humans. But in the final decade of his life, the issue of animal suffering came increasingly into his view as a theological problem, and he formed an integral part of his mature theology of the new creation. Thus, he begins his remarkable sermon, The General Deliverance, written in 1782, which was about 10 years before his death, with a quotation from Psalm 145:9 in the Book of Common Prayer. His mercy is over all his works. Yet Wesley asks if the creator and father of every living, thus he begins in, lost my place here. Hold on one second. Yet Wesley asks if the creator and father of every living thing is rich in mercy towards all, if he does not overlook or despise any of the works of his own hands, if he desires even the meanest of them to be happy according to their degree, how come it to pass that such a complication of evils oppresses, yea, overwhelms them? And so he's talking about in nature, about how animals, God does not desire animals to suffer, and yet they suffer tremendously in nature. And so why is that? Um, in Sermon 60, The General Deliverance, he answers that the question by arguing that all animal suffering, including that which various species currently inflict upon one another to ensure their own survival, is the result of the fall. Thus, before the fall, animal creation was happy and enjoyed a kind of perfection according to their kind, which was seen in their loving obedience to humanity, who, as God's vice regents, were God's appointed conveyors of blessings to all other creatures. The obedience of animals to humanity, therefore, could be seen as bearing some shadowy resemblance of even moral goodness. In short, animals in the original creation were, Wesley suggests, at peace with humanity and with one another. And so that's Genesis 1-2 he's commenting on. Yet, as a result of the fall, humanity's relationship to God was disrupted, and therefore the blessings of God no longer flow through human stewardship to God's creatures. After the fall, then, animals came to be at war with one another. It is because of sin that an immense majority of creatures, perhaps 1,000,000 to 1, cannot otherwise preserve their own lives than by destroying their fellow creatures. And so, moreover, humanity's loving and kind stewardship of animal creation has been turned into an exploitative domination. And humanity has become such an enemy of animals that his cruelty surpasses that of a shark hunting its prey. And so Wesley not only was critical of what animals do to one another because of the fall, but he was also critical of what humanity does to animals. He said that humanity has become an enemy of animals and that man's cruelty surpasses that of a shark hunting its prey. And I could just even imagine what he would say about factory farming today, because that didn't exist in his time. The only thing that existed in his time was slaughterhouses, and he still considered that to be cruel, just like a shark hunting its prey. And so he viewed very much this idea of what humans do to animals is terrible, and very much a condemner of it. Wesley is unwilling to grant that such animosity and brutality is part of God's original design for his creatures. Why would God allow animals to be subject to such vanities? Surely, he reasons, God will one day restore animal creation to a state which is superior to that of the original creation. As they have been subjected to a degree of the corruption brought on by the fall, so also will they be liberated to experience a measure of the glorious liberty of the children of God in the new creation. And so, just like Wesley, he views Genesis 1-2 as historically appropriate, as a paradise for humans and animals. He says that upon Jesus' return in the new creation or the new earth, that animals and humans will once again be at peace with one another. And he quotes Romans 8. He says that animals will experience a measure of the glorious liberty of the children of God. Just like humans will experience liberty from death and decay, animals will also experience liberty from death and decay. And so this will entail a greater strength, swiftness, and understanding than each creature in its kind has possessed in the original creation. And like human creatures, they will be delivered from all irregular appetites, from all unruly passions, from every disposition that is either evil in itself or has a tendency to evil. Therefore, as they had originally been able to evidence a shadowy resemblance of even moral goodness, so in the new creation, no rage will be found in any creature, no fierceness, no cruelty, or thirst for blood. And so he even admits that within animals, there will be no such thing as carnivory, no rage, no fierceness, no cruelty, and likewise, no such thing as that in man either. And this author says, as I said, these reflections on the place of non-human creatures in God's plan of redemption are an important aspect of Wesley's late thinking about the new creation. And so John Wesley, this is from this source here, but John Wesley was an incredible ally for what he said about animals, because he admitted that the fall has created a very complex situation of cruelty, and that includes what humans do to animals. And then I found this article, actually. This was really interesting. This was by Randy Alcorn. It was on his website about John Wesley. Now, what I mean by this, too, this might be perceived as offensive, but I don't mean for it to be, but it's about John Wesley and his riding on horses. And I thought he had some pretty good quotes about this, but it's still horse exploitation. But in context, people didn't have cars back then. This is right before the American Revolution. The only way to travel very quickly was by horse. And so, if you have any sort of sensitivity about riding horses, feel free to, overlook this. I thought it was a nice quote, because in the context, John Wesley was pretty nice to horses, whereas his contemporaries often weren't. And so I thought that was important to talk about. But the love and trust of a horse and John Wesley's relationship with horses. And so in this book, In Creatures Like Us, Lynn Sharp explores the awareness and sensitivity of horses to their environment and the emotions of people around them. She's found that horses possess a phenomenal ability to decipher human emotional cues and real body language. Friends can discuss with one another over a cup of coffee what seems to be going on in the life of a mutual friend. Obviously, the horse cannot do this. In fact, horses probably don't even like coffee. But their horse may have a deeper intuitive knowledge about the human that rides them than the person's friends do. And the friends might miss the signs of a suicidal depression that the horse can clearly sense, even though they cannot communicate it except perhaps to the one whose eyes they look into. And God gave horses just the eyes that might save their human's life. If you've experienced the love and trust of an animal, whether it's from a horse, a dog, a cat, or any other kind of animal, you know it's profoundly moving. And no wonder, since God has coupled mankind in the animal kingdom, not only through the order of creation, with humans immediately following animals on the sixth day, but also through his mandate that we govern the animals in Genesis 1:26. I like how Randy Alcorn puts that too. He says, he doesn't say stewardship, some vague word like that. He says that we have the mandate that we govern the animals in Genesis 1:26. And govern is what I would say is take care of. And so Alcorn has always been a really good theologian, and one that I've learned a lot from. This makes me think of the 18th, and Alcorn says, this makes me think of the 18th century evangelist and theologian John Wesley, who lived from 1703 to 1791, who spent an unbelievably large portion of his life on horseback as he rode from town to town, preaching the gospel in farmers' fields and land surrounding coal mines, the colliers. Since Wesley spent so much time with horses, he knew them well and was grateful to the God who so clearly loves and praises them. He knew God had good reasons for making animals, including transporting him to maybe 20 times more people in his lifetime so that they could hear him preach the gospel. At a conservative estimate, he preached more than 40,000 sermons, some to congregations in excess of 20,000 people. And so he regularly preached 4 or 5 times a day. His sermon register from January 1747 to December 1761 reveals that he delivered 7,000 sermons on 1,354 texts. So between 14 years, he delivered 7,000 sermons, which is insane. It's been calculated that Wesley traveled on horseback an astounding 250,000 miles, the equivalent of 10 times around the entire earth. And in his journal, Wesley recorded on March 17, 1746, I took my leave of Newcastle. My horse was exceedingly lame, meaning the horse had trouble moving. We could not discern what it was that was amiss, and yet he would scarce set his foot to the ground. By riding thus 7 miles, I was thoroughly tired, and my head ached. I even thought, cannot God heal either man or beast by any means or without any? Immediately my weariness and headache ceased, and my horse's lameness in the same instant. Nor did he halt any more either that day or the next. And so what he's getting at is that this horse was lame, and then he started to feel sort of ill himself. And so he prayed to God, and then his horse and himself were both healed. And so I thought that was sort of a nice, wholesome story from John Wesley. And Alcorn says, I can see John Wesley practicing his sermons with and praying for his horse as he rode 25 miles day after day, occasionally as many as 90 miles to preach 3 times and move on. Wesley's closest companions were horses, who were no doubt grateful he was 5'3" and weighed only 128 pounds. So he was a pretty small guy. But he wrote in his journal, nearly 30 years ago, I was thinking, how is it that no horse ever stumbles while I am reading? And he read history, poetry, and philosophy. He commonly read on horseback, having other employment at other times. And so he would read on horseback while the horse took him to a place. No account can possibly be given but this, because then I throw the reins on his neck, I then myself set to observe, and I aver that in riding above 100,000 miles, I scarcely ever remember any horse, except 2 that would fall head over heels anyway, to fall or make a considerable stumble while I rode with a slack rein. And so what he means is while he was reading the Bible or reading some other thing while the horse was walking, the horse would never stumble. And he said, to fancy, therefore, that a tight rein prevents stumbling is a capital blunder. I have repeated the trial more frequently than most men in the kingdom can do. A slack rein will prevent stumbling if anything will, but in some horses nothing can. After he had fed, watered, and brushed his mount, I could easily see Wesley at a campfire reading Job 39:19-25 to his horse from the Bible carried in his saddlebag, which he often read and memorized as he rode. And so what Wesley was kind of saying there, and that's a little bit of Old English, so it's kind of hard to understand what he means, but what he was saying was that he was surprised because, he wasn't really paying attention to the road essentially, and he was reading his Bible or reading something else while his horse took him, and yet the horse never stumbled. And so he thought that might have been sort of a godly act or an act of divine intervention. But Wesley cites Job 39:19-25, and that says, "Have you given the horse its strength or clothed its neck with a flowing mane? Did you give it the ability to leap like a locust? Its majestic snorting is terrifying. It paws the earth and rejoices in its strength when it charges out to battle. It laughs at fear and is unafraid. It does not run from the sword. The arrows rattle against it, and the spear and javelin flash. It paws the ground fiercely and rushes forward into battle when the ram's horn blows. It snorts at the sound of the horn. It senses the battle in the distance. It quivers at the captain's commands and the noise of battle." And so I thought that was kind of interesting, that quote, because it's very respectful of horses in the Bible and talking about how beautiful of creatures they are and how majestic they are. And then I also found this article. It says, God and Dog and John Wesley. John Wesley was the founder of Methodism. He led an interesting life. In Sermon 60, The General Deliverance, Wesley has some interesting things to say about God and animals. And so he cites Romans 8:19-22 NRSV here, but it says, the biblical text reads, "For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the children of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not of its own will, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and will obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning in labor pains until now." And so Romans 8:19-22, that's basically Paul saying that, God created Eden, which was perfect. And then because of the curse, because Adam and Eve's disobedience, life was subjected to death and decay. And so all of animals and all of humans are subjected to that. But after the curse is removed, animals and humans will be liberated from death and decay. And so meaning on the new earth, and humans and animals will live in peace, and there will no longer be any suffering or cruelty present or death. Wesley begins by asserting, this is Wesley's commentary on Romans 8:19-22. Wesley begins by asserting that God cares for all of God's creation, and then asks the age-old question, how is it that misery of all kinds overspreads the face of the earth? First, he considers the original state of humans and animals. Humans possessed perfect understanding and lived in perfect harmony with God. Animals in their original state also lived on animal-appropriate perfect life. Before the fall, mankind and animals lived pain-free, happy, pleasurable, and immortal existences. And so what happened? The fall of humanity affected animals. As all the blessings of this is Wesley, as all the blessings of God in paradise flowed through man to the inferior creatures, as man was the great channel of communication between the Creator and the whole brute creation. So when man made himself incapable of transmitting those blessings, that communication was necessarily cut off. And the result of this is the very foundations of their nature are out of course, are turned upside down. As man is deprived of his perfection, his loving obedience to God, so brutes or animals are deprived of their perfection, their loving obedience to man. The far greater part of them flee from him, studiously avoid his hated presence. The most of the rest set him at open defiance, yea, destroy him, if it will be in their power. A few only, those whom we commonly term domestic animals, retain more or less of their original disposition through the mercy of God. Love him still and pay obedience to him. And so Wesley also claims that the original beauty of the animals has been lost, and now they are terrible and grisly to look upon. Now animals suffer from disease and the weather. After the fall, not only do animals destroy each other, but they are also exposed to the violence and cruelty of him that is now their common enemy, man. And so I thought that was really interesting that, again, Wesley cites Genesis 1-2 to say that humans and animals lived in harmony, they didn't hurt each other, and then now animals suffer from disease and the weather because of the curse that the humans brought into the world, but also it's interesting. He says in quotes, the animals are exposed to the violence and cruelty of him that is now their common enemy, man. And so he highlights and says that man is incredibly cruel to animals. And then I had a comment come through. Craig said, "What do you think about horse riding? I see it as animal exploitation." That's a really good question, actually, because I would tend to agree. I don't think I necessarily have a solid view of it. I think I would need to see more studies, because I think what it is I was pretty against horse riding now, obviously, I don't think there's any question here as far as horseback riding for like racing, like horse racing, horse carriages, all of those exploitative forms. I think are very bad and I think very immoral, especially because they hurt animals for just mere entertainment. In Genesis 49:6, that's cited. But um, I think now, like I did meet a woman that explained to me. She said I have horses and I ride them just as like for pleasure. So like she'll get up every morning, go get her coffee and breakfast, and then go take a horse ride. And she seems to say that the horses enjoy it. And I used to not believe that necessarily, but I believe, see a study that said that horses actually, depending on who the rider is, they actually do enjoy having them on their back. And it sort of becomes an experience for the rider and the horse. My inclination says that to be on the cautious side, maybe that's probably not a good idea because it's dangerous. But I can see where if someone argued and said, my horse likes it, and so therefore it's okay, where it's like sort of enriching for them. I could maybe see that maybe where there's an argument for that, but I'm not strict about it. I think that it's probably better off if you just leave the horse alone. But I'm not going to go after people that pleasure ride their horses. I don't think that that's necessarily a huge problem. I think that was the worst problem that we had. It would be a pretty good existence, but I can see arguments on both sides. But I don't necessarily, especially in this day and age, I don't think that it's definitely not something that we need to do. If I saw studies that said that it was always enriching for the horse, then I would probably be more inclined to leave it alone. But I don't know what those studies say, and it probably depends on the horse. It depends on the rider. But so hopefully I don't have a solid answer for you, but I probably would say I lean towards being against it, but I'm not entirely, not one to be a stickler about it. But with Romans 8 as his text, Wesley makes the case that animals will be part of the new creation. And so that's something that you heard very much, pun intended, from the horse's mouth. Wesley said that animals will be part of the new creation. And that's something that has been universally acknowledged throughout Christian history. Wesley claims that they will be restored to a far higher degree than they ever enjoyed before the fall. In fact, Wesley speculates that if God wishes, the animals may become capable of knowing and loving and enjoying the author of their being. Wesley gives reasons why we should spend time considering the condition and fate of animals, and because God cares for animals, we also should care for them. Wesley notes that since animals are not moral agents, they cannot sin, but yet they suffer. The problem of animal suffering may cause us to question God's justice. Wesley writes that something better remains after death for these poor creatures also, that these likewise shall one day be delivered from this bondage of corruption, that shall then receive an ample amends for all of their present sufferings. So that was a really nice quote by Wesley. He said that animals, even though they suffer now, they will be amended in the future, and they'll receive ample amends for all their present sufferings. And so that's a very nice quote from John Wesley. Obviously, very much a friend to animals. And so this author says, in this sermon, Wesley does not follow the mainstream Christian tradition in its denial of the value of animals. He preaches a theology that affirms animals as worthy of the Creator's love and redemption. The fall of humankind affects the entire earth in terrible ways, but God's redemption not only restores humankind, but includes in wonderful new ways all animal kind as well. Yeah, all animal kind as well. And so this author says that after the curse is gone, that humans and animals will find that they'll find amends from God, and that they will be restored from suffering and cruelty. And then there's the source for that, by the way, too. And then another important point too is that John Wesley actually was a vegetarian. Vegan was sort of unknown at the time. I think he might have been vegan, but I can't remember exactly. But we'll get into it. But John Wesley became a vegetarian as a young adult. He discovered that he no longer got sick after he stopped eating anything with a face, and so he stuck by his diet for the rest of his life. As he grew in fame, he was accused of being a moral vegetarian, or someone who insists that eating meat is against God's will. John assured the Bishop of London that he did not insist or teach this. He even tried to eat meat again so people wouldn't look down on him, but his doctor encouraged him to remain vegetarian. Even though John was a vegetarian primarily for health reasons, he had a very high view of animals in God's creation. In his sermon, The General Deliverance, found at this link, John noted many places in Scripture where God is merciful over all his works, caring for the well-being of the animals. John taught that animal suffering, including animal predation, is a result of the fall of humanity and will not exist in the new creation. He taught that a better life awaits the animals in heaven, and therefore we ought to take great care in how we treat the animals in this life. And so this author and Wesley cite Romans 8:19 to 20:22, which we talked about. The famous animal passages, Isaiah 11:6-9 and 65:25. Psalm 145:9, God shows mercy to all of his creation. And then Revelation 5:13-14, where there are animals currently in heaven. And this author says, what do you think about animal salvation? How does that impact how you treat animals in this world? And so I think that was a really good comment about how Wesley, and you'll see that too, that Wesley was a vegetarian, but he kind of wasn't forceful about it. And I think that kind of did more of a hindrance. I think he could have been a little bit more promoting about it because, as we can see now, people were glued to their human nature in that they enjoyed animal flesh even back then. And so that was something that was very difficult for people to accept the idea of getting rid of. And so Wesley worked with their human nature and said that it wasn't a it wasn't a requirement of Christianity, but I think he could have been a little more forceful with that. Craig Wesker said, good answer about horse riding. Thank you. Appreciate your knowledge of church history and theology over the past 500 years. Thank you so much, Craig. I really appreciate that. And thank you for your teachings as well. I always find, I always say, when anybody mentions about, needing a book review or something answered about theology, if I can't answer it, I always say, go to Craig Wesco. He's a great ally and a great colleague. And you do a great job with your show as well. And I always appreciate your work that you do for the animals. And, I always mention Jason Bueno as well. You guys do a great job. But diet and health, John Wesley, church silence promotes violence, an article series from allcreatures.org. And it says, church silence promotes violence to humans, to animals, to our environment, to our economy, to our education, to our finances, and to our health. And this is by our very own Frank Hoffman, along with his Mary T, his widow. I'm sorry, I should say he's the widow of her, but you know what I mean. But the church collectively has been strangely silent on the connection between our diet and health and our physical and spiritual well-being. The only major exceptions to this silence that we are aware of have been the Seventh-day Adventist Church and the non-affiliated ministry of George H. Malcolmus, who founded Hallelujah Acres. I need to look into him, actually, because I think I might be friends with someone from Hallelujah Acres on Facebook. I'll have to look them up. But anyways, very early in John Wesley's ministry, he realized that there was a connection between physical and spiritual health. If the body was sick, then the person's focus would likely be diverted from God. When he came to America in the mid-1700s, he continued this teaching and was criticized for it by local clergy and the Anglican Bishop of London. Following is an excerpt from John Wesley's response to the bishop. By extraordinary strictness and severities, I presume your lordship means the abstaining from wine and animal food, which, it is sure, Christianity does not require. But if you do, I fear your lordship is not thoroughly informed of the matter of fact. I began to do this about 12 years ago when I had no thought of annoying parochial ministers or of captivating any people thereby, unless it were the Chickasaw or Choctaw Indians. But I resumed the use of them both about 2 years after for the sake of some who thought I made it a point of conscience, telling them I will eat flesh while the world standeth rather than make my brother to offend. Dr. Chain advised me to leave them off again, assuring me, till you do, you will never be free from fevers. And since I have taken his advice, I have been free, blessed be God, from all bodily disorders. And so it's really interesting what Wesley said, because he was not a moral vegetarian, but he was very much a vegetarian for health reasons, because he would get fevers. I don't know exactly what that means. I don't know if maybe it just made him sick from meat, but he swore off of all meat. And then he sort of told people that said that he was a moral vegetarian that he was not, and then he started eating meat in front of them to prove that, and then he got sick again. And so that was sort of like an indication that maybe he should have been a little bit more forceful about how, God condemns the eating of meat. I think he had a little bit too much Romans 14 in his mind rather than Genesis 1. But Frank Hoffman, another great theologian, continues, both John Wesley and his physician knew that the eating of animals and their byproducts, eggs and dairy, was injurious to health. Wesley had firsthand knowledge of this, as we do today, but most people don't want to hear about it. Why? Because most people don't want to change their lifestyle, so they resort to trying to silence the prophets of truth. And for a little while, they were successful in doing so with John Wesley. However, when his illnesses returned, he resumed being a strict vegetarian and he regained his health. Unfortunately, Wesley was not forceful enough with passing along these truths about diet and health. And as a result, most of these vegetarian dietary truths have been lost in the teachings of the Methodist and other churches among whom he had influence. It is time we reverse this mistake. We have an obligation to learn about the connections between animal foods and chronic illnesses and about a proper vegetarian diet. Likewise, we have an obligation to speak forth to our congregations about these things, for to do otherwise promotes violence to their health, to their spiritual well-being, and to their personal finances. Personally, we never found out about these things in the church. Our education about diet and health came from our own experience and from people and organizations outside the church. Poor health can be a tremendous drain on personal finances, and when people worry about these things, it has an injurious effect on their physical well-being, so that their health is further deteriorated. Thus, our silence on the advantages of a vegetarian and vegan diet really does violence to people's health, finances, and well-being. Jesus is often referred to as the great physician. It is interesting to note that God's original intent was for us and our fellow creatures to eat only plant foods, Genesis 1:29-30. The diet of good health and healing was set in motion from the very beginning for all who would receive it. We have an obligation to learn and speak out. And so that was a great article by Frank Hoffman from our very own All Creatures, saying that we need to speak out and we need to be loud about our vegetarianism and veganism that we preach to people, because it's God's will. It is God's will. And the more that we can get people to abstain from flesh foods, the more that we can help their spiritual well-being, their physical well-being, as well as animal well-being, and the health of the earth as well. And so, it's very much a message of God. And I think Wesley, if he had any flaws, that was the only one, is he maybe just wasn't a little too vocal about his vegetarianism. I would always say, if it was a modern thing, I'd say, you're there. It's just, you have to just connect the dots. But David Leonard Clough, born June 6, 1968, is a British author and academic with a focus on the Christian vegetarian and Christian vegan movements. So I want to talk about him for a little bit before I close out. He is the professor in theology and applied sciences at the University of Aberdeen and a Methodist preacher. He's also the founder and co-director of the Creature Kind Project, which focuses on the welfare of farmed animals as a faith issue. And so I've been in connection many times with Creature Kind. They're a really great organization. He is the author of a number of books on animal rights, and in particular the use of animals for food, including the 2-volume monograph entitled On Animals, Volume 1, Systematic Theology, which was published in 2011, and On Animals, Volume 2, Systematic Theology, 2018. He was also co-editor of the collection of essays, Creaturely Theology, on God, Humans, and Other Animals, which was published in 2009. And he has written articles on the ethics of the use of animals for food, including Consuming Animal Creatures, The Christian Ethics of Eating Animals, 2016. It was published in Studies in Christian Ethics. Clough has given a number of keynote speeches, including at the Sark's Creature Conference in March 2017, and he's been a participant in many public debates, including a debate with Peter Singer on the theology and ethics of the treatment of non-human animals. And so very academic individual, has a lot of credits to his name as far as animal rights and animal welfare related theology. He even had a debate with the founder, or the leader of animal rights, Peter Singer, who wrote Animal Liberation. He had a debate with him, which I bet would probably be interesting. But I found this article. It says Methodists and Other Animals, Time to Reclaim a Legacy by David Clough. In 1760, Horace Walpole is said to have remarked that a man was turning Methodist, for in the middle of conversation he rose and opened the window to let out a moth. And this was cited in an article by Philip Sampson. And so it's interesting that Horace Walpole, he identified a Methodist because of the kindness he showed toward a moth. I thought that was really interesting. And so Methodists have always sort of had a compassionate sensibility about them. Perhaps this reputation Methodists had for being concerned about animals comes as a surprise to you, but it was well-founded. John Wesley wrote an essay on the souls of animals, referred to them frequently in his journal, published the book A Survey of the Wisdom of God in Creation, that discussed animals, and preached a famous sermon on Romans 8 called The General Deliverance, which we talked about many times in this teaching, in which he stated that the Bible was clear that animals would be redeemed by God, and that Christians should be concerned about the cruelties inflicted on them daily in the streets. Walpole's comment indicates that his concern was widely shared among Methodists, and early Methodist magazines regularly included articles opposing cruelty towards animals. This Methodist history and a concern for animals finds its place in a wider history of broader Christian concern, particularly among evangelicals. Most Christians are now aware that Christians were responsible for the campaigning for the first legislation against cruelty towards animals, and they founded the RSPCA in the first part of the 19th century. And the RSPCA is the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, which was founded in the UK and then has since gone to Australia and spread over. I cite them actually a lot when it comes to rodeo. They have a very, very strong stance against rodeo. But the RSPCA definitely has Christian roots. I know they're not perfect. They've been criticized for, maybe too much welfarism and things like that. But later, Christians were at the forefront of campaigns against the cruelties of vivisection, seeing it as a clear example of the weak being exploited by the strong, contrary to Christian teaching. And that's very much something that, as we talked about last week or 2 weeks ago with C.S. Lewis about the cruelties of vivisection, that has a long history of being opposed by Christian teaching. This activism in defense of animals was in strong continuity with long Christian traditions of being concerned about animals. John Calvin preached that God will condemn us from cruel and unkind folk if we pity not this brute beast. And the early 15th century the Ten Commandments stated that men should have compassion on beasts and birds and not harm them without cause and have regard for the fact that they are God's creatures. And many early stories of Christian saints included examples of their compassion towards animals. These roots of Methodist and wider Christian concern for animals comes as news to most Methodists and most Christians. We tend to see concerns for animals as a secular concern, sometimes even to the extent of thinking Christianity gives us divine permission to exploit animals without being concerned about them. There are atheist perspectives on animal rights that reinforce this message and identify Christianity as part of the problem in relation to cruelties inflicted upon animals. And he makes a good point. He says, but it's a historical mistake to think that concern for animals is not deeply embedded in Christian faith. But those who have come to associate Christians with a lack of concern for animals could take the ways the animals we eat are treated as evidence. Most of us are unaware or insufficiently concerned that most chickens raised for meat in broiler sheds are bred in windowless sheds to reach slaughter weight in only 35 days. All commercially produced eggs require the culling of male chicks after hatching. All male chicks after hatching. Most pigs are raised in crowded bare sheds that give no opportunity for their diverse natural behaviors. Dairy cows are often also kept indoors, have their calves taken away immediately after birth, and are culled for beef after 3 or 4 pregnancies. Sheep and cattle raised for beef usually do better, but we kill lambs at only a few months of age and still inflict painful procedures such as castration on calves and lambs without anesthetic. And all of this isn't good for humans either. It contributes to obesity, diabetes, human food and water insecurity, and climate change. What we are currently doing is clearly bad for humans, bad for animals, and bad for the planet. Here's a proposal. As Methodists, we could reclaim our legacy to join with other Christians to be in the vanguard of a modern movement against cruelty to animals, starting with what we are doing to farmed animals. We could make clear that raising animals in this way is contrary to our faith and commit to reducing our consumption of animal products and choosing higher welfare options in our church catering and our own homes. Jesus taught that not a single sparrow is forgotten by God in Matthew 10:29 and Luke 12:6. Who's in for remembering our Methodist legacy and our Christian responsibilities toward other animals? And so that was by Mr. Clough there in his teaching, which was, I thought, a very wonderful article about how Christians should be concerned for animals, especially farmed animals, because of the vast history of Christianity being concerned about those things. And that's why we say animal rights and animal welfare are very much a Christian concern historically, but it's been sort of lost through time. And a lot of that because of, sort of this humanism that has put humans so far above animals that, we can't see clearly. And Christianity is sort of assimilated into that as well. And then also because of sort of a side effect of Darwinism, because Darwin said that humans are animals. Christianity had sort of a knee-jerk reaction to that and said that, oh, no, we're not. And, we can do whatever we want to them. And so, and that's where we're at today is I think that, like David Clough said, there's a strong element of Christian teaching historically that has concern for animals, and we should embrace that. But that's the conclusion of my presentation. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. This was one of my favorite teachings, actually, because Methodism always had a really strong component with animals and social justice. And so I knew this would be sort of an easy article to talk about, an easy subject to talk about. And I really appreciate John Wesley and also David Clough. But I'll pray. If anybody has any questions, just feel free to let me know. I'll end in prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for allowing me to present these teachings on the godly man and John Wesley. Help us to look to his words for inspiration and to copy his behavior, his perfect love that he showed, not only for Christ, but also for the brute creation, as he would say, the animals. And help us to reflect your kindness and your mercy until one day in Isaiah 11:6-9, the humans and animals shall neither hurt nor destroy in all your holy mountain. And I'll be back in 2 weeks. I believe I'm talking about the Baptist Church at the end of September. And so I will see you then. And then until then, have a great Sunday. Have a great week. And then I'll see you back here in 2 weeks. Thanks so much.